Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I wanted to share another recording from our AOP Mastermind Live 2022 event that took place a few weeks ago. This session was called Unlocking the X Factor in Procurement Transformation. And it's not easy to strike a balance between the need for speed, control, and compliance. Get it right, you've unlocked the X Factor. Get it wrong, and the customer experience will suffer. And the business wants more convenience, but procurement is wired to ensure control. So can we satisfy both at the same time? Well, in this conversation, I talked with Radhika Samant, the VP of Finance and Head of Global Procurement at Optimizely, and Lalitha Rajagopalan, the co-founder and Head of Strategy at ORO Labs. They share their thoughts on the procurement X Factor and why it's so critical to transformation. Now, in my first questions, I asked Radhika, who is also VP of Finance at Optimizely and has a background as a finance leader, how that experience shaped her approach as she looked to build a procurement function.
So, just as an outsider, like in the fact that where I was a CFO, obviously procurement was kind of part of my role because we were, in setups or companies which were a lot more self-sufficient than having a completely independent procurement function. But having interacted number of times or seen these kinds of organizations, there's always this perception that it's very stoogey. They're, not there to create value. They're really there to set up barriers and those kinds of things. So coming in as a CFO and being asked to lead this function was very exciting for me because I think spend in any company is a very big part of the spectrum, and it requires equal amount of attention as would revenue. And many times I think the procurement team can be a huge influencer of that. So actually I'm a fan of procurement done right. So very excited to have this opportunity at Optimizely to see that dream kind of come true.
And we could probably talk for the whole half an hour about turning procurement into a revenue driver versus just a cost manager. And I say just not to diminish that, but I think it's one of the holy grail for procurement is to position itself in a way that sales, marketing, and other areas of the business can position themselves as aligned to the top line versus the bottom line. So maybe we'll get into a couple of those things as we go through the conversation. Lalitha, I do want to bring you in as well. So you've got a lot of experience from a procurement technology perspective, spent a lot of years in the leadership team at Ariba before going out and co-founding your own organization called ORO. What was the gap in the market that you saw, or the opportunity, or the pain point that you saw that you felt, you really wanted to divert all of your energies into solving?
Well, you know what they say, you can take a girl out of procurement, but only for so long. So I'm a certified procurement geek. I actually think it's a very interesting problem to solve. I think technology has done a lot to make things easy within an organization. But when it comes to between companies, between organizations, there's still a lot of friction to be solved. And what I felt was that, my journey at SAP Ariba, and even looking at all the procurement technologies, is that procurement from a technology perspective still remains a very transactive architecture, if you will, right? It's all centered around a requisition, a binary approval or no, and, about spend management. And I feel that it has lost its relationship management angle in terms of what is it that human beings at each end of the spectrum are trying to do. And I felt that it's really important to be something that can be a change maker here. So can procurement actually get a seat at the table, be in the room where it happens, and can technology aid them in doing that? And that's why I was really excited to see architecturally, is it something that we can build from ground up? One example, my co-founders and I always say is look at Salesforce. They don't talk about, order to cash. They talk about leads and opportunities and value generation. So why can't procurement basically play a similar role on the other flip side of the coin?
So we framed the conversation at the beginning around the X factor for procurement. And Radhika, I'm going to ask you this first of all. What does this idea of an X factor in procurement mean for you?
So coming into Optimizely, and first of all, when I took over the procurement function, one of the challenges that I kind of faced was this perception that procurement is just there to create barriers and delay the process. And when I looked at some of the literature that had been put out or shared out, it was a lot about, the purchase order process. You can't get your invoice paid without a PO. And if you make procurement only about that, then there is no X factor, because you lose speed, you lose control, you lose compliance becomes the primary, right? So that doesn't work. Looking at reinventing this, I think the X factor for procurement needs to be centered around a few different things. One, the recognition that your customer is actually responsible for revenue generation in most cases, or product, both of which influence revenue, right? So speed is of essence to them. There is no choice. They need to move fast, and we need to be empathetic to that cause, and portray and partner with them to enable that. The control and compliance pieces need to be a result of. I mean, if it's done right, then that's what's required. And when I started to think through how I wanted to solve this problem at Optimizely, I think Lalita mentioned the people, the human beings, right? Ultimately, it's pulling those human beings together into a common framework that you can look at together and make the same decisions. I'm very convinced that a set of intelligent people, given the same set of information, will probably come to the same conclusions. And it just takes away the friction, right? So one of the classic things with working with Oro for me, with Lalita, is being everything that I wish and desire. It's like, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that, because they've thought about it in that fashion.
Yeah.
So it's that marrying of process and system and people at the center of it, that I think drives that X factor. And that's how that collaboration can happen. You need to get to the same goals, and it will work out.
Now, we have a question. Radhika, I'm going to come to you with that question in a minute, but I do want to come to Lalitha, because we talked a lot about the people, process, technology, and where the procurement X factor is amongst those. You've obviously spent a lot of time around technology. How do you bring, or what's your experience of bringing together all those three? Or is there one that's more important than the other? Or kind of, how do we balance it so we're not just focusing on one specific thing?
I think there are, I like to frame this as like a necessary condition and a sufficient condition, right? I think the necessary condition is the will of the people, or culturally is an organization ready to basically hand the baton back to employees. And I think we are at a tipping point where we are seeing that it's no longer a command and control, centralized kind of a process. Businesses, because they need to move fast, have given a lot of agency to employees to make business decisions. Okay, so that, I think we're at a tipping point from people's mindset and being able to take responsibility and be a self-driving process. The process itself, the one thing that I will say is that this is probably the hardest thing, because the reality, what we see with the SaaS explosion and everything, right? Not even a small organization will be a single tool to do them all, right? You cannot have a single procurement tool to rule them all, kind of a thing. So you are going to have end-to-end process, a start to finish process that makes sense for all of the stakeholders in the process. You can't be the legal is in the legal system and then that part becomes a black box. So visibility for people to be able to work and collaborate together is something that's really necessary for the process to work. And that's where technology comes in. And I feel that technology has to enable self-governance, and the visibility and the user experience is not enough just for the intake part or the requester or the supplier experience. It's not as if legal or data privacy is kind of like, just twiddling their thumb and being meanie pigs. They are trying to do their job, if you will. So I think it's really important for technology to be an enabler for activating the end-to-end ease of use and efficiency.
Yeah, we've definitely talked a lot today throughout our different sessions around how do we think about the stakeholder experience and how do we help to devolve responsibility for certain elements back into the business, or create transparency so that stakeholders, so that procurement isn't a black box. Because ultimately we've spent so long of procurement just being this black box where people don't really know what's happening, they don't know where to go for answers, and that causes a lot of frustration. Now, we talked in this session a couple of times around compliance. And so this is where one of the questions that came in, I'm going to ask this because it was asked specifically to you, Radhika. Given your point of view on control and compliance, how do you measure the success of your procurement team?
I think I measure the success of my procurement team not by control and compliance, because I think that should be an output of the system itself and the process that we follow. So the success of the procurement team is on how quickly were they able to get the deals done, how much value did they add to negotiation, did they start with a where did we start, where did we end, how did they partner with the business, and is the business actually reaching out to procurement proactively, to my procurement team, to partner with them and ask them and inviting them into the deals. The control and compliance piece of it, if done right, I really believe it's just creating visibility. It's making sure that there is a place where all of the contracts and details are available. It's allowing access to the compliance team and to the legal teams to do their job, and making sure that all of those factors are taken in. And from a CFO angle, the most important piece is pulling together all of that contract and obligation data, and having it accessible and available for any kind of a fundraise process, sale process, whatever may happen in a company life cycle.
Now, I have another question that I think I know the answer to because we've already covered it, but it came in from the audience, so I'm going to ask it just to go around the table. Rather than speaking about compliance, should procurement talk about process in terms of how our stakeholders impact revenue and operations?
Philip, could I take that one, please, to lead? Because this is my passion project right now. I'm so excited with it that I just want to share this. When I started thinking about procurement, I really started about thinking about stakeholder impact, because one is shareholder impact, and then I'm going to move it down to stakeholder impact, actually, because ultimately there is a common goal that every business has, and that's to build value. And I think about value in influencers in three different components. One is revenue. Procurement directly impacts revenue growth because you enable the fastest possible way, and return on investment it's the other part of the equation in return on investment, right? The second portion is obviously efficiency and profitability. We impact that directly because obviously we negotiate the best possible deals and make sure that it's as efficient as possible. And the third is preservation of value. Now, this is not a topic that people think about too much, but preservation of value is all about making sure that that risk, compliance, data availability, all of that is happening, right? So that to me is one thing that immediately ties our stakeholders and procurement together into a common goal, and that's really important. When you think about the stakeholder impact and revenue and operations, I actually think of procurement should be a mirror image of how revenue operations has come up. Revenue operations has become a driver, and it's a I remember a time when it didn't exist, but it's become like this major function now that actually enables sales and revenue. If you think about procurement, spend is the other side of that. You have to find the right vendors. You have to find the enablers to drive revenue on the spend side of it. So why not mirror the same organization? So I have my procurement team in two parts. One is the procurement piece of it, who are the people who are experts, many years, 35 years plus of experience in dealing with negotiations and handling contracts and selecting vendors in the best possible way. But the other side of this equation is procurement operations, which I like to refer to as spend operations. I really think every company needs a spend operations team that starts from the point at which a team member or some employee in the company feels the need to incur an expense. And then just build that visibility and take it all the way through the process of identifying the need. Are the right stakeholders? Okay, do we agree this is a business need? Giving opportunity for people to interact by exception. That's what ORO enables for us. Take it all the way to authorized signatories to say, yeah, the purchase approval is occurred. You can sign this. And the PO should just be released because, at least in our world, unless it's a rate contract or it's an items goods PO, right? It should just be raised. So if you can enable spend operations to create visibility into spend, and enable procurement to drive that value that I talked about in terms of revenue, efficiency, and preservation, you suddenly have a function that should come into the limelight and should absolutely be a partner, both to FP&A, all FP&A and accounting, as well as to business stakeholders. And really, that's what I'm trying to imagine and create at Optimize the. And I'm so grateful because from a system standpoint, I think coming across ORO and being able to say this and keep hearing, yeah, that's possible, has been like a game changer. So that I think the technology piece of it is definitely a driver in the X factor.
I do want to just come back and because I had a question that I want to dispel the myth that the only thing that a CFO cares about is cost savings. Because I think that's what us as procurement, it's kind of beaten into us from the early days, is to demonstrate our value, we have to drive cost savings. It's like cost savings at all costs. You obviously talked there about revenue. You talked about efficiencies. You talked about preservation of value. How do you, what answer would you give to people who still think, hey, to demonstrate value to finance, it has to be all about savings?
I mean, if you think that the CFO only cares about expense, I mean, just think about the CFO's role, right? The CFO's role is to make sure that the value of the company is going up. The role is not to cut cost. If you're cutting cost and it's impacting execution, you suddenly just depleted the value of the organization.
Yeah.
So if you truly want to be a partner with your CFO, you have to imagine the fact that his interest is in optimizing or getting to the best possible value, obviously, and that's the ROI conversation, right? Yes, of course, you should negotiate your contracts to the best possible level, but you also need to build the relationship with the vendors. You can't be in a relationship with vendors that is contentious. You actually need proactive adoption. I mean, software is a huge part of our game, right? We need to purchase so much software. Marketing requires their events and agencies and all of those people to be really tied into them. So we can't be on a cost cutting mission. I think we have to get to fair value for both parties, of course, do our best possible to make sure we are getting fair value. And that is a critical part of the function. But the CFO really cares about everything else as well. Execution, is the software getting deployed, making sure we are taking out any spend in the business that's actually shelfware. There are so many different ways in ways. Like for me right now, my whole plan is around, okay, I have now got access to all my renewals data. I want procurement to proactively start looking at those, not with the intention of, oh, can we renew it flat or less, but is it deployed in the business?
Yeah.
Let's make sure that we are partnering with them to see that, and make a strategy, come up with a plan. And that's how you change the value of what procurement can be. And you will be lockstep with the CFO, no question about it.
You're driving efficiencies through demand management, as opposed to just going and, making everybody's life more difficult by reducing cost. We talked about compliance earlier. And I think one of the things that we get a bad reputation for in procurement in slowing down the process is trying to manage compliance to everything, as opposed to having just an exception process. Can you talk a little bit about how you think we should be thinking about managing by exception versus, trying to govern everything?
I think part of it is actually the way the legacy procurement technology was built and deployed, like circa 1990s technology, if you think about it, right? You had the CrowdJig matrix, so you had the standardized, items which procurement had, purchasing power to negotiate and put in a catalog or whatever, and everything else was wild west. And basically, you kind of shoved that whole lot into, ad hoc spend request or non-catalog item or something like that. And architecturally, the systems were basically designed as an approval workflow, which was designed to say no if you don't, go on the main line, if you go, right? And I think that when you say manage by exception, a big part of being able to empower business users to do what they need to do, buy what they need to buy, engage with the suppliers they need to engage with, not for themselves, but because their job required it, right? A big part of it is actually context enablement, right? Can you make the context automatic and clear for all the stakeholders so that managing by exception is actually possible? And I think that's a big differentiator in terms of, can a software be not a naked software, which all it does is say yes, no to things if it doesn't meet the criteria, but can it be an intelligent workflow, a smart workflow, which brings context, which brings the data with the thing? I mean, with working with Radhika, right? One of the most interesting things is like, hey, my team doesn't own the budget. The spend budget is owned by the department heads, but they lack visibility today before they make a commitment. So when they are trying to approve a spend, they lack visibility to what is the state of the union of their budget, right? What is the visibility? How much have we committed? How much have we already paid out? What's the demand signal that's coming down the pipeline? Now that is essentially managing by exception. Like, I'm not saying no because it's not compliant, but from financial control perspective, in these times, I really need to dial the knob more effectively in terms of how I want my budget to be used. And that's a decision you need to empower the teams.
So I know it's time to wrap up. So I want to thank you, Lalitha. Thank you, Radhika, for joining us for this session on really how to think about the X factor from a procurement perspective. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.